Hi, I'm Rick Atkins, pastor here at CFCC. Welcome. We hope you enjoy this sermon and that God uses it to grow you in your relationship with Him. Before we get started, our goal is not to replace your investment in a local church with online content. We were made for community. We want to encourage you to engage in a local church with your gifts. See, when the people of God invest in the community of God, they experience the transformative power of God, and that is our hope and prayer for you. Again, thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the sermon.
Well, good morning, church family, and happy Mother's Day. I am super bummed that we cannot be together to recognize you and appreciate you in person. But we do want to take a moment just to thank all of our mothers, to appreciate all of our mothers for all that they do and for the role that you have in our lives, for the impact you have on our lives. There are not enough words in our language or any other to express how much you mean to us and the role that you play. But I want to say, in the book of Genesis, Eve is called the mother of all things before she has children. So biblically, motherhood is about more than just having a biological child, and that is not in any way to diminish having a biological child, but that the Bible talks about motherhood as being a lot of different ways, a lot of different types, right? There are spiritual mothers who invest in us and who connect us to Jesus and grow us and help us mature and become the followers of Him that we are. There are adoptive mothers, foster mothers, biological mothers, influential mothers. There are relational mothers. A lot of, and I think of this a lot of times as like as teachers, right? Women who are investing in their students, who go above and beyond, play kind of in a lot of them, motherly roles, and in some students, more of a motherly role than that person may have in their biological life. A mother is someone who nurtures, someone who cares, someone who loves and who sacrifices for others. And there is all different types of mothers, but there are no ways to describe how important and how valuable you are in our lives. And so we just want to take a moment and to thank you, to recognize you. One day out of a year is not nearly enough to express all that should be said in gratitude for the role that you play in our lives. But so kids, be nice to mom today. Do something nice for her. You have no idea. You cannot appreciate how much she gives up, how hard she works, how much she cares for you, and how much she's willing to endure just to bring a smile to your face or to give you an opportunity for success. Guys, be nice to your wives today. At the very least, she puts up with you. And that's saying a lot. Happy Mother's Day. Normally on Mother's Day, we do family dedication, but not being able to be together, we felt it would be better to postpone that. We are still going to do it this year, but we're going to push it back to the fall where we can be together when all the restrictions have kind of shifted and been removed or lifted in some way. We wanted to be able to do that then. So we will still have a family dedication, it just won't be on Mother's Day this year thanks to our social isolation. Which has been, like 6 or 7 weeks? I've lost all track of time for how long we haven't been together. But it gets frustrating, right? We're starting to get anxious, starting to get eager, waiting for our return, waiting for that opportunity for us to be reunited as a church family together in one place. And it's waiting, and we're waiting, and kind of getting sick of waiting. But here's the thing, the Christian life, it's always been about waiting. We live waiting between the resurrection of Jesus and the return of Jesus. And so in the waiting that we have and this longing that we have for our reunion with each other, we can't lose sight of the fact that we have a greater longing for a greater reunion, not just with the people of God, but with God Himself, with the King who is returning. And so we have this constant longing. But all throughout the gospel, what Jesus does is He teaches us how to wait. He has very specific, very clear instructions for what proper waiting should look like in the Christian life because Jesus wants us to be prepared. And so as we go through this series on the parables of Jesus, the parables that Jesus tells are practical, relatable stories to help us understand some of the complexities of the kingdom of God. And this morning, we're going to look at a very, very relevant parable to the situation we find ourselves in through all this waiting for life to get back to normal, for things to sort of return to some semblance of normalcy, regardless of whether that looks the same as it did before. we're in a holding pattern, we've been in a waiting pattern, and so Jesus speaks very directly into that with this parable. So I think it will be very good to connect with. If you've got a Bible or a Bible app with you, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 25, verse 14. If you're interested in doing a little bit more research after this, you can go to Luke 19. Jesus tells this. Basically, it's the same parable. Some of the details are a little bit different, but it's the same essential story. We're going to focus on Matthew's account, but Luke does give us a very similar parable. But before we get into the parable itself, there's a story that we need to understand in order to fully appreciate this parable that Jesus tells. It's a story of a man named Archelaus. Archelaus is the son of Herod the Great. He, when his father died, becomes the ruler of Judea and Samaria, and he wants to become not just the ruler, but the king. And so he decides to leave the country, to go to Rome, to appeal to Caesar, to make him king over this area, because he wasn't happy with the amount of power he had. He wanted more power. He wanted a bigger title and a bigger name. And so he goes on this journey, leaving his country behind to make his case. But the Jews hated him. They did not want him to be king. And so the Jews sent a delegation to Rome to appeal to the emperor to not make Archelaus their king. Now, Rome, as an empire that had stretched itself very thin, one of its biggest priorities was to maintain peace and order within the countries that had already been conquered, because they can't expand more if they have to come back and continually put down rebellions internally. And so when the emperor finds out that Archelaus does not just lack support from his people, but actually has active disdain from his people, not only does he refuse to make Archelaus king, he deposes him. All of Archelaus' possessions, his estate, his resources, they're all taken from him and redistributed to other nobles. This was a very commonly known, very well-known event, historical event that happened during Jesus' life, about 25 years before this. So when Jesus starts telling this story, his audience will immediately start recognizing what it's connected to. And so they're going to go, oh, okay, we know how this is going to end. We know where this is going. We see this because we know the story that Jesus is referencing. And so that's where we pick up Matthew 25, verse 14. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went away and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. All right, so in order to understand a parable, the first thing we have to do is we have to understand the elements of that parable. And so you have this master who represents Jesus. You have the servants who represent professing Christians, people who claim to follow and serve Jesus. And then you have the talents. Now, we hear talents and we think skills. Jesus' audience heard talents and they thought money. See, a talent was a measurement of weight. It was typically used for precious metals, and so the value of a talent depended on the specific metal that you were talking about, whether it was gold, silver, or copper. Scholars estimate that the value of a single talent would be somewhere between $600,000 and $900,000. So we're not talking about pocket change. This is a considerable sum of money that the master entrusts to his servants based on their ability. Now, we think of talents differently. We perceive them differently. The truth is, both audiences, Jesus' audience and us, we limit talent too much. So think of a talent as this. We try to dismiss the money side of it altogether because we don't want to talk about it. Ultimately, this is a financial parable. It is talking about money. So we can't take money out of the equation because money is the root of this particular equation. But it's about more than money. It is about our skills. It's about our connections. It's about our resources. It's about the relationships that we have, the opportunities that we have. Think of a talent like this. Anything that you are connected to or have influence in is a talent that you have been entrusted with. Okay? So any resource, anything, whether it's money, whether it's time, whether it's relationship, all of those things are talents. For Mother's Day, your kids, that's a talent. That is something with which you have been entrusted, and that is a very important, very valuable talent in raising children in a godly home and teaching them to love and follow Jesus. That is a huge talent. Everything that we have access to, influence over, is a talent that Jesus has entrusted us. But here's the question. What do we do with the talents that we have? How are we investing the talents that we have? See, the cool thing about what it notes here is that Jesus gives talents to his servants based on their ability or their ableness. So there's a couple of things that stand out in that. The first is that Jesus knows his servants. He knows our strengths. He knows our weaknesses. He knows the obstacles that we face. He knows our limitations. So Jesus is not a one-size-fits-all ruler where he just gives everybody the same thing and expects the same thing. No, what Jesus entrusts us is customized based on his knowledge of us, which is perfect, right? So Jesus knows us, and he entrusts us with various degrees of talent based on what he knows we are able to handle. So Jesus knows you. The second thing that tells us is that Jesus is not going to overburden you. He's not going to give you more than you're capable of dealing with, because what Jesus gives you is based on what he knows you're able to handle. So he's not going to give you so much that you just can't carry the weight of it and you become encumbered by it, nor is he going to give you so little that you're sitting around going, Jesus, why didn't you give me more? I could have done more. And for some of us, what we start with is not what we end with. See, what this parable also tells us is how to get entrusted with more. So if you want to know, how do I get more from Jesus? How do I get Jesus to trust me with more than he's already given me? The solution is right here. Be faithful with what you have, and Jesus will entrust you with more. So we see that Jesus tailors what he gives each servant based on what they are able to handle. What that means, see, what we have a tendency of doing in our society is comparing ourselves. We measure our success, we measure how well we're doing and how we stack up by comparing ourselves to the people around us. But what Jesus is saying is you can't do that. Right? You can't compare yourself to somebody else because you weren't given what they were given. You don't have the same obstacles that they have. You don't have the same burdens, the same skills and gifts. You don't have the same things, so you can't compare. The 1-talent servant can't compare themselves to the 10-talent servant and go, well, I haven't produced nearly as much. All that's going to do is create discouragement. Because that servant with 10 talents probably doesn't have the same obstacles to overcome, probably doesn't have the same burdens and the same weight that they're carrying around. We can't compare ourselves up because it will just dishearten us. At the same time, the servant with 10 talents can't look at the servant with 1 talent and go, wow, I'm doing really well. I've produced twice as much as they have. Because producing twice as much when you were given 10 times as much is not very effective. Listen, Jesus gives us, what he entrusts us is based on his knowledge of us, based on what we are able to handle. What Jesus expects from us is a direct result of what Jesus has entrusted us with. The more Jesus gives you, the more Jesus entrusts you, the more Jesus expects from you. We cannot measure our success by comparing ourselves to others because we were not given what they were given. We don't have what they have. Each person is responsible to Jesus for what we do with what he has entrusted us. And what Jesus looks for, what Jesus measures our response with, is not our fruitfulness. It's not how much we've produced. It's our faithfulness. Jesus looks at how faithful we are with what he has given to us. So, what I want you to do, not today because it's Mother's Day, you need to be focusing on that, but what I want you to do is I want you to make a list of all the things that you have in your life, the relationships that you have, the finances that you have, your resources, your time, the connections, your work, everything that you have access to or connection with. I want you to write it all down. That's the talent that you've been entrusted with. And when you look at that list, I want you to ask yourself, what am I doing with the resources that Jesus has given me for his kingdom? What am I doing with this to faithfully live this out? So I want to shift gears here from the elements of the parable to the response that we see in the parable. So you got these first 2 servants whose response to the parable in the parable is the same. It says they got to work at once. They immediately went out. The master entrusts them with money, and before he's even out of view, they're off running around, investing, putting that money to work so that they can faithfully produce more for their master. They don't do the thing that we often do. I'll get to it later. I'll get to that tomorrow. I'll deal with that later. I'm going to serve Jesus. I want to invest in Jesus. I want to prioritize that. But first, I need to get this new job. First, I need to get this promotion or this raise, or I need to get this new house or this thing or that thing. When this happens, and you can fill in that blank with whatever you want. But when I get here, when I reach this point, then I'll invest. Then I'll connect. Then I'll serve. They don't do that. The first two servants get to work immediately. They don't take a vacation. They don't sit back and okay, let's sleep in a little bit tomorrow and then no, they get to work right away. Then we have the third servant. The third servant is so passionate about his master's work that he does nothing. He takes the talent that he was given, he digs a hole in the ground, and he buries it. Now, a lot of people, and a lot of times the assumption here is that he is lazy. I don't think that that's right. I mean, the master does call him lazy, but I think it's more than laziness here because it would take no extra effort to take that same money, put it in a bank, and let it earn interest. He still doesn't have to touch it. He just sets it there and leaves it. There's a reason he buried it rather than invest it. And that's where understanding the story of Archaeus comes in. See, in the story of Archaeus, this well-known historical event, the master left, and the master did not return. All of his resources, everything that he had was redistributed. So in the story of Archaeus, which the audience would naturally be assuming that Jesus was referencing, in that story, everything that the first two servants did, everything they earned would be taken away from them, given to someone else. There'd be no reward, no appreciation. They had wasted their efforts because now they no longer have a master and no one appreciates what they did. And so based on this historical event, the audience hears what Jesus is saying, and they naturally assume that the third servant is the wise servant. Because you can't repossess and redistribute what you don't know exists. So being there's no record of this third servant's talent, he hides it rather than invests it. There's no way to repossess it. So once they come through and they take all their master's stuff, the third servant can go dig up the talent, and he goes from being a servant to being a master because he was wise. He bet that the master wouldn't return, and the master didn't return. So from their expectation, the third servant is the smart servant, and he's the example that they should follow. Well, then Jesus continues in verse 19. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here is what is yours. But the master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So Jesus takes the story, and he flips it upside down. And suddenly, the wise servant is actually a wicked servant because he did not do what his master expected him to do. Because he bet that the master wouldn't return, and Jesus did. You see, while this story actually seems to imitate the story of Archaeus, the truth is that this parable is about Jesus. Jesus is just getting ready to go to Jerusalem, where he is going to be betrayed, where he's going to be arrested, where he's going to be murdered, and then he'll rise from the dead. Jesus is the master who is getting ready to go away for a time. But the twist on the well-known historical event is that Jesus says, I'm coming back. I'm going to return. And when I return, you better be ready. And so Jesus tells us this parable to show his followers, his professed servants, what being ready looks like, what he expects of us in response to what he has entrusted to us. So for the first two servants, what you'll notice is that the response that Jesus has for them is the same. They didn't produce the same amount because Jesus doesn't measure our success based on our fruitfulness, but rather based on our faithfulness. Both servants are given the exact same reward. Well done. Come and share your master's joy. They are rewarded for what they were faithful with. For the third servant, though, the servant who was not quite so faithful, he tries to appeal to divine pity. He makes excuses and justifications. And it's funny, what he says sounds a lot like what Adam says in the garden. If you remember back when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, God had entrusted the one rule, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, to Adam. Eve ate first, then Adam ate, because he was standing right there. God says to Adam, what did you do? Because he's holding Adam responsible for this action. And what does Adam say? He goes, it wasn't my fault, it's the woman who you gave me. Right? So Adam takes his guilt, he takes his wrongdoing, and he tries to turn it around and blame God for it. Well, that's the same thing that the servant is doing here. He goes, well, it's not my fault I didn't do anything. I knew that you were a harsh man. I knew that you expected too much. I knew this about, it's your fault that I didn't produce. And I think, man, how often is this exactly how we treat God? We do something wrong, we get caught, we make excuses, we justify ourselves, we go, oh, here's my reason, here's why I did that, God, it's your fault. You know, you shouldn't have given me this, you shouldn't have done that, you shouldn't have allowed me to be in this situation. How often do we find ourselves trying to justify our wrongdoing and in the process blaming God for our own wickedness? Jesus doesn't accept his excuses. See, we can tell ourselves whatever we want. We can justify ourselves however we want. It can be convincing to ourselves and to anyone we talk to. But Jesus knows our hearts. He knows the motivation behind our actions, and he does not accept justification. He does not accept those excuses. Jesus calls the servant wicked. He calls the servant lazy, and he takes everything away from him. We finish the parable in verse 28. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he will have in abundance. But to the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The description that Jesus gives of the place the wicked servant is to be sent is the exact same description that Jesus uses for hell. Here's the thing that should startle us about this. We're not told of any sin in the wicked servant's life. We're not told of any wrongdoing, any moral failure, any corruption. All he did was bet that the master wouldn't return. All he did was to live for himself. He hoarded it so that he would have access to it. He kept what we become like this wicked servant when we keep the gifts that we have, the talents, our abilities, when we hold on to them for ourselves, when we use them for our good and maybe the good of our family, but we don't invest them in the kingdom, when we don't use what God has given us for God's glory, we become like this wicked servant. When we tell ourselves, I'll get to that tomorrow, I'll get to that later. It's funny how many times we say later and later never comes. Later is just a nice way of saying never. The more we postpone doing what Jesus expects us to do because of what he has entrusted us with, the more we become like this wicked servant who had the talent, who had the resources that the master had given him, but rather than using them for the master's good, for the master's glory, he kept it for himself. He tried to hoard it for himself. He's called wicked for that. He's called lazy for that. He loses everything for that. That alone should startle us out of our procrastination, out of our apathy towards the gospel, and fill us with a sense of urgency for the kingdom of God. You see, the thing that scares me the most about this text is that I'm concerned that we are a society so focused on comfort that we neglect faithfulness. We get caught up in trying to use what we have to reach our goals, to accomplish our agendas, to do what we believe we want to do. And we neglect and we postpone and we procrastinate investing in the things of God, into the eternal things, into the enduring things, into the things that bring Jesus pleasure and joy. Because the truth of this story and what Jesus is trying to make clear, and he makes clear all throughout the Gospels, is that we need to be ready. Because we have no idea how long we have. See, the reason the first two servants got to work at once was because they didn't know how long the master was going to be gone. They didn't know how long they had. And so they felt this sense of urgency to do the work that the master had entrusted to them because they didn't know how long they had to get it done. And so they got to work immediately. And this is the proper faithful Christian response. We need to have an urgency for the gospel. We need to have an urgency for the lost people around us. We need to have an urgency for the hurting, for the broken, for the mistreated, for the families that are living in injustice. We need to have an urgency to share the love and grace of Jesus because we don't know how long we have to share it. We don't know if we have a tomorrow. We could die, or even more so, Jesus could return. What Jesus makes clear in Scripture is that being ready means living ready. It means we live each and every moment of our lives as if that moment could be the last moment, because we're not going to get a warning. Right? Our services, before we go into our services, we got a 5-minute countdown. Jesus ain't going to give you that. Right? He's not going to give you a little notice that, hey, I'm going to come back in a few minutes, so get yourself ready. If you're not ready when Jesus returns, if you're not in an active state of readiness, you're not going to be ready when he returns. Jesus makes very clear he is going to return, that he is the king that is coming back. And when he does, it will be after a long time, which it's been in this holding pattern for a while. When Jesus returns, he will settle accounts with his servants. He will judge them based on their faithfulness with what he has entrusted them with. Jesus knows what you have, and what he expects of you is based on what he has given to you. But make no mistake, he does expect. He does have expectations for what you're going to do with those things. And so we are to live ready. See, we live between the resurrection of Jesus and the return of Jesus. And Jesus calls us to be a people who are watchful for his return, a people who are working for his return, because we don't know how long we are going to be waiting for his return. So we live as if each moment could be the last moment we have to share with that person we love who Jesus is. We live as if each moment is the most critical moment in our lives for investing and serving him. In whatever way you have. See, Jesus has given each and every one of us time, talent, and treasure. He has placed people in your life who you have a connection to that no one else has the way you have it. You have influence, you have opportunity, you have relationships, all of which you can use for his glory, all of which you can use for their good. And what Jesus is looking for is not fruitfulness. Jesus is not going to call us at the end and say, hey, I needed you to bring 75 people to me. How many did you get? He's not looking at notches on your belt. His measure of your success is not based on your fruitfulness, but on your faithfulness. Were you faithful with the resources you were given? Were you faithful with the opportunities that you had? What did you do? What are you doing with what Jesus has given to you? That is the question each and every one of us should ask. We can't compare ourselves to others. I can't compare myself to Rick or to Mark because I don't have what they have. They don't have what I have. But what Jesus has given me, I have a responsibility to use faithfully for his kingdom, for his glory, to invest it in him so that when he returns, I have something to show him. You see, what every single follower of Jesus should live for, work for, chase towards is to hear these words: well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come, share in the joy of your master. There is no greater thing that we will ever hear than that. But the only way that Jesus will say to us, "Well done, good and faithful servant," is if we have been faithful with what he has given to us. So when you make the list of the resources you have in your life, I want you to ask yourself, what have I done with these for the kingdom of God? How have I used these things for him? And how could I improve that in the future? Let me pray. Heavenly Father, God, we praise you for the life that you give, for the love that you have. That you didn't just save us from sin, but that you saved us for service, that you gave us a purpose, that you gave us a mission, and that you gave us the tools that we needed to be successful in that mission. God, I pray that each and every one of us would be stirred towards faithfulness in pursuit of your kingdom, would be stirred to use what we have, whether great or small, to honor you, to glorify you, and to live for you. May every person who calls themselves by your name live in such a way as to hear at the end of time, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." May our work, may our lives, may everything in our hearts be pleasing in your sight. God, forgive us where we fall short. Have mercy on us where we get distracted. Drive us from our procrastination. Drive us out of our spiritual apathy, that we might live every moment for you. We thank you for Jesus. We thank you for grace. Amen. Church, we have an opportunity to express some of that faithfulness, to invest some of the resources and the things that God has entrusted us with into practical, real work in the community around us. One of our strategic ministry partners, Helping Hand, is gathering food, and they feed homeless and struggling parts of our community. Helping take care of the poor and the hurting is one of the great commissions of Jesus, one of the great components that we're told as Christians to do. And so we have the opportunity to serve those who could really use help. And so if you have resources at this time, if you have the ability, we're going to put up a slide in just a second here that shows some of the items that they're trying to collect so that we can help meet that need. We're going to have a box outside our front office door. If you want to gather some of those supplies, bring those up. For those of you who've done so already, we put this into an email earlier on in the week and talked about this a little bit then. For those of you who've already brought up supplies, thank you. As always, your generosity is an incredible thing to see, and it is a beautiful aspect of faithful kingdom living. But there's always room for more. We can do more. If those of you who haven't done that yet, if you're interested in doing something like that and just being able to serve and invest in others during this time, there'll be a box in front of our door. You can come by, drop that stuff off, social distance service to our community. You can do that. But it's a great opportunity as well for us just to live out a little bit of that faithfulness with the resources that we have. Thank you guys for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful Mother's Day. Remember, be nice, be loving to your moms, to your wives. And we will look forward to our reunion very soon as we wait with eager anticipation. Have a great week. We love you guys.